Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Trass from Environmental Defense Fund, and we're really happy to co-host this event today with the Green Hydrogen Organization and Natural Resources Defense Council. You'll meet folks from each of those organizations shortly. And I want to welcome you all and show my appreciation for your coming to this event, Hydrogen at a Crossroads. We promise we're going to cover a lot of terrain. Some of it's very technical, but I think you'll see how important it all is. So we're really happy you're part of this conversation. I want to extend a special welcome to Minister Cecilia from Aruba, who's the Minister of Tourism, Trade, and Labor, and his assistant who are here, sorry, I'm so sorry, you're not his assistant, you're the head of Foreign Affairs. I'm sorry, would you mind introducing yourself quickly? Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate you both being here. And I also want to give a warm welcome to all of you for making the effort to be here on what is a very hectic day of Climate Week. So I want to do a quick run of show just so you know what to expect. I'm going to level set a little bit, introduce the topic briefly, and then I'm going to invite our expert panel to join me to engage in a conversation about some of the details. And then we are going to open it up to all of you for what will hopefully be, an interesting and robust conversation. Feel free to ask any questions, make any comments that you want. Our plan is to wrap up maybe around noon, shortly thereafter, and then a lunch is going to be served right outside. Feel free to stay, have lunch, and continue the conversation informally in any of the tables out in the main space. So. Why are we here today? Why do we want to talk about this moment as hydrogen at a crossroads? I think, as you may know, hydrogen has gone through some cycles of, there was a lot of hype. If you go back to 2022, hydrogen was going to save the world. Since then, we've gone through a cooling off period. Projects haven't gotten funded at the rate we had hoped. Projects haven't gotten off the ground at the rate we had hoped. But I'm here to say, and the reason for this event is that it's still so very important that we're talking about hydrogen. And just to give you one example of how important hydrogen still is today, if you look at the list of 30 priorities put forward by the COP presidency for COP30, their climate action agenda, you'll see that number 2 on the list is to tackle, to provide those low carbon, zero carbon technologies necessary to tackle the hard to abate sectors. Now, we could argue about what all of those technologies are. There's a lot of momentum right now for biofuels. CCS is certainly part of the picture in some contexts. They all have challenges, but really hydrogen is probably our most promising tool to decarbonize shipping, aviation, heavy industries, steel, cement, and so on. I think, and that's why you all are here. How do we tackle those hardest to abate sectors? So hydrogen is still very important. And yes, many of you are involved in project development and project finance. Projects, it's hard, but projects are still happening. And why we're here today is because we need to make sure that those projects that come through are truly high value for the climate and for the wider economy and society. And so getting the standards right is really crucial to that. Around the world right now, national governments and many other types of institutions, including the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, are all working on standard-setting processes and country-level targets and the regulatory and policy frameworks that are necessary to enable this market. That's happening right now, and that's the work that we want to talk about today. As you can see here, and this is just sort of a quick recap of hydrogen. From a climate perspective, yes, hydrogen is carbon free, and that is a wonderful attribute of hydrogen. However, its production and its management and its use can generate emissions. If we're not careful, if we don't design our frameworks correctly, we could end up with emissions that we did not intend. Obviously, you can see in that first gray box, the current hydrogen that we have today, gray hydrogen made from fossil fuels, natural gas, as well as coal, is highly polluting. It is, if you added up all those emissions, it would equal about the emissions globally of aviation. Gray hydrogen is a pretty big source right now of emissions. So we need to decarbonize gray hydrogen, because here we're talking about not just carbon, but also methane and even hydrogen emissions themselves that add up to the carbon intensity, the GHG intensity of gray hydrogen. We'll talk more about some of those details. Moving on into sort of the new world, the blue hydrogen and the green hydrogen that we're trying to get to, those cleaner and greener forms of hydrogen. They still have emissions, and I think that is maybe one of the key points, key takeaways from this session is they still have emissions we have to manage. If we're making blue hydrogen, we have to think about upstream methane emissions. We have to think about how effective our carbon capture technologies are, and we even, again, have to manage hydrogen emissions. Green hydrogen has, not quite so hard of a job. It comes in pretty clean already. We still have to think about hydrogen emissions. That's one component. Again, we'll talk more about that. And we also have to think about how clean that renewable power is. Is it really renewable power? Is it displacing other grid decarbonization efforts? How clean is the grid it's drawing from? These are issues we have to think about when we think about getting green hydrogen right. So across the board, there are many factors we have to optimize for. All of these we'll discuss in greater detail. But I think the point in here is that every country involved in this hydrogen economy is setting their own standards right now and their own targets for the GHG intensity that they will allow. And you can see on this chart here that there's a real range. Obviously, where we are today with gray hydrogen is quite high, and the scale here is all based on kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of hydrogen. That's the metric we use. And you can see a wide range from Brazil at 7 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of hydrogen, down to the EU landing around 2.4. So there's a real range. And so you can already see the challenge if you're talking about trade and how do we talk about hydrogen from a climate perspective. Some of the factors that I've already alluded to that we'll get into in more detail are these. We think these are the key factors that drive. If you're really looking at the scientific underpinnings, you're going deep into the climate science of hydrogen, these are the factors that make the difference. And these are the factors that really need to be part of any accounting methodology that we develop for hydrogen today. And they include electricity sourcing. Again, that's the green hydrogen piece. There's a wide range of CO2 intensities that can be derived depending on where your electricity is coming from. Upstream methane leakage, that's a huge one. That is absolutely, perhaps the biggest one that we have to worry about. It's also the easiest one to solve for. Methane emissions can be minimized. We have the technology to detect them, to minimize them, to keep those leak rates down. But right now we see a wide range worldwide, anywhere from below 1% up to 8%. And let me tell you, 8% makes a huge difference, and it could really make the difference of whether or not hydrogen is climate beneficial or not. Also for blue hydrogen, we have to worry about carbon management. Today, most CCS systems, most carbon capture systems are only capturing about 50% of the emissions. So it's very difficult to say that blue hydrogen is carbon-free. We know that technology exists to do much, much better, and I think many of you are involved in projects such as that, of getting to like 90%, 99%. This is possible, and we have to push toward, when we deploy blue, we have to push for maximum carbon capture efficiency. And then finally, hydrogen emissions. My colleague Morgan is going to talk more about that. But basically, hydrogen has its own warming impact that we have to solve for. We have to make sure we don't let hydrogen leak. We can't let it be vented or purged. We have to keep it in the system because it also can contribute to warming. And right now, we don't have good data on how much hydrogen is being released. But what we do know is we have estimates in the literature that shows anything from well below 1% up to 20 or so percent when you're thinking about liquefaction and you actually have to vent and purge lines for safety reasons. You could be losing quite a lot of hydrogen. That's something through technology we think we can fix. Better practices, we can fix that problem. So just a quick case study to show you what this all means. This is a blue hydrogen case study. So here the issues are upstream methane emissions, to what extent they're being minimized, how effective carbon capture is, and how effective hydrogen emission management is. And you can see the black line is our status quo line. That's the fossil fuel status quo. And if the green bar shows getting blue hydrogen right. That means maximum carbon capture efficiency, minimized upstream methane leaks, minimized hydrogen emissions. We can do pretty well against fossil fuels. However, at the far end, the red box, we can see if we don't get those factors right, if we aren't capturing our carbon sufficiently, if we have high upstream methane emissions, we end up with a situation where blue hydrogen is worse for the climate than the status quo. Obviously, that's not something we want, certainly not if we're investing public funds in blue hydrogen as a climate solution. So just one example there to kind of set the stage. Why does this matter? I think you all know why it matters. It's because we're trying to build demand for hydrogen. We need to get this market off the ground, and we need it to be credible, and we need to deliver what it can deliver. We need to enable international trade. We need common standards. The work that we'll talk about a little bit that the International Organization for Standards, ISO, is doing right now is attempting to do that. We think it's a good effort, and it needs a little more help to get a bit more rigorous so we really can feel that we have high integrity baseline for trade. And then finally, of course, why we're doing it, it's the climate. We're doing this for the climate, and so we have to make sure we achieve the climate outcomes that we all need, again, particularly if there's public investment. So there are many other factors at stake that we don't have the space to talk about today. It's not just about climate. There's air quality issues. There's water issues. There's social impact issues. We can't get into all of that today, but maybe during the comment period, some of you would like to bring that up. So I'm going to invite our panelists to join me now. We have Pete Boudin, who is Senior Advocate for Hydrogen at Natural Resources Defense Council. Thank you, Pete. Please take a seat, maybe sit right there. And then we have Morgan Roach, Senior Director for Fuels and Feedstocks at Environmental Defense Fund, my dear colleague. And Joe Williams is joining us from the Green Hydrogen Organization, where he is Deputy CEO. So they all have a lot of information to share, so we're just going to dive right in. Can I sit here?
All right, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Well, so I wanted to start by, digging in a little bit deeper into some of the topics that I just sped through just now. And I'd like to start maybe with you, Pete, if you're game, to explain a little bit more about some of these factors that influence hydrogen's climate impact. And your real specialty is on green hydrogen and electricity accounting. So I'd love for you to take us through that.
Absolutely. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Pete Boudin. I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Really excited to talk to you all today about standards for hydrogen. It's a pretty nerdy topic, but I'm glad we have a packed room to talk about it because I do think it's very impactful and important that we have these conversations. So as Beth teed up, the electricity accounting for green hydrogen is really the critical metric to get right when we're talking about what is the climate impact of green hydrogen. The only inputs are electricity and water, but it does take a lot of electricity, 50 kilowatt hours roughly for a kilogram of hydrogen, which means even just replacing our current 10 million tons a year of gray hydrogen in the US would require the entire energy demand of the state of Texas, 500 terawatt hours. So this is a big issue. If we're going to scale up clean hydrogen and green hydrogen, we need to make sure that the electricity is truly clean because there's a lot of it needed. So if you're making projects off-grid, that's a pretty easy problem. Not easy, but it's a, let's say, straightforward question. Like, have you built renewable energy or have you built a gas plant? And if you built renewable energy and you're plugged directly into that, you can pretty credibly claim you've used just that renewable energy. Things get more complicated when we plug into a grid which has a lot of different generators and consumers on it. And that's why we have to be very careful about the impacts of the load that hydrogen is adding to the grid. Thankfully, a set of solutions has emerged that we've been calling the 3 pillars, and these have been adopted in various different jurisdictions, and that can prevent some of the adverse impacts on the grid pretty effectively. What you can see on the slide shows that, it's not quite showing the right thing, but what it should show on the left is that status quo hydrogen has 10 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. So that's converting methane or natural gas directly into hydrogen. But if you use the average US grid today, which is roughly the carbon intensity is dominated by natural gas, which is the biggest generator in the US, then using that electricity directly would be twice as bad as directly converting methane to hydrogen. And if you use coal-powered electricity, so if you're somewhere with a very coal-dominated grid and you aren't taking care to make sure you're using renewables, it can be 4 times as bad or even worse. And on the right, we've got kind of a tiny sliver of green, which could be all the way down to 0 if you're using 100% renewables. So as I said, the way to ensure you're in that sliver of green rather than inducing extra gas and coal generation on the grid is to make sure you're hourly matching. That's the first requirement. So matching your consumption of electricity with the generation of clean energy on an hour-by-hour basis. You're doing it in the same region of the grid, so geographic matching as well, making sure that the renewables you've claimed to use aren't hidden from you behind a transmission constraint. And then finally, making sure you're using new, additional, or incremental resources. You're not claiming to use, for example, a hydro plant that's been online for decades and decades and would otherwise have been serving the grid, and you're diverting it to yourself, and that could cause, gas or coal to ramp up in its place. So those are the 3 criteria that we feel are really important to definitely consider in a hydrogen standard. The EU and the US and some other jurisdictions have already included these criteria in various different ways. There's phase-ins, there's different ways to implement them, but there are 3 incredibly important factors that must be considered. You can't just ignore them and leave them out and just hope for the best. It's really important that we consider them and get that right. So I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks. And Joe, from the Green Hydrogen Organization's perspective, how do you think about these issues?
Yeah, I mean, on the sort of electrolytic hydrogen using renewable energy, I think, if we were in a more of a utopia where we had 100% renewables in our system, we wouldn't need to worry too much about these issues. But in the majority of jurisdictions around the world, that simply isn't the case. So these guardrails are absolutely essential from our perspective. We would work with a lot of industry, and this week, even in New York, we've been discussing these so-called 3 pillars. Additionality, hourly and geographical matching of electricity consumption and generation. And one thing that the industry has come out with, across the board, as far as we can see, is they want stability in the regulatory regime. Some of you might know that in the European Union at the moment, the 3 pillars, which have been in place for a couple of years now, they're under attack. There are some elements of industry and some industry groups which want to see those 3 pillars relaxed immediately because they're not seeing the ramp up in green hydrogen that they were hoping for. And the fact is actually that the ramp up is mainly due to other factors. One is member states not putting in place the demand mandates that they promised to do under the regulations. That needs to be followed up with. Permitting, as you all know, is always a big bottleneck. So just getting the renewable electricity to an electrolyzer is not a simple thing. So that's why the ramp up has been slower than expected. And of course, we're in an inflationary environment, and it's just costing more across the board. So, I think there's been a lot of attacking of these 3 pillars, when in fact the real sort of villains in this are not related necessarily to the 3 pillars. So we as GH2, we're behind these 3 pillars. We think they need to be maintained. We'll look in a couple of years about whether industry has truly scaled up, but we need a bit more time to see how it works. And there's a review clause actually within the EU. I think by July 2028, the European Commission will do a full review of those rules. And at that point, let's have a good discussion. But I think any sort of early tinkering is going to really upset the business models of a number of the companies who have spent years modeling their business, agreements upon these three pillars. And one thing I love to tell my European colleagues is, we're here in the US, and we know that there are challenges on renewable energy at the moment, given the political environment. But I haven't heard anyone this week from the US side attacking the three pillars anywhere. Why are we attacking them in Europe?
Good point, Joe. While you have the now take the mic back. I would love to ask you now to sort of put the blue hydrogen hat on and talk about what are the factors, go a little deeper into those factors that really matter if we really want a level playing field across green and blue hydrogen.
Great. Yeah. I mean, Sorry, I'm not going to put a blue hydrogen hat on, okay. But at the same time, we know that the world's sort of current hydrogen production is made from fossil fuels. Nearly 100 million tons a year. We know we can't shift from that today to all green hydrogen tomorrow. There's going to have to be something in the middle, and we know that continued use, particularly of natural gas in hydrogen production, is going to be a thing. So, if you can really reduce the emissions for so-called blue hydrogen, so splitting methane into hydrogen and CO2, then great. If you can reduce the climate impact as much as possible, and as Beth alluded to earlier, there's a couple of kind of key issues that we're looking at here. One is the upstream sort of default values, the upstream sort of leakage rates of methane, which is over 20 years is a very sort of climate forcing gas, and over 100 years has an impact as well. And then upstream, further downstream, you have the CO2 capture issue. And some recent research by some partners of ours in Europe, actually, Transport and Environment, have looked at this issue in the context of the European Union's low carbon hydrogen Delegated Act. And they've sort of looked at what sort of capture rates that you would need if you used LNG from different parts of the world to make blue hydrogen in the European Union. And you can see that if you're going to import US LNG, you're going to have to capture 128% of your carbon, which is a tall order, given that there isn't that much available to capture. And this is all on the baseline of a 70% reduction to a fossil fuel comparator. So 70% reduction in what hydrogen currently relates to in terms of emissions. And so that's actually quite generous. Beth sort of referred to the 3.4 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen. That's what's being required here. Actually, as we move towards climate neutrality in 2050, we need to move towards limiting it at least to 80 or 90%. The sort of the EU by 2040, for example, wants to move to 90% reduction across all of its industries. So that red line that you see there actually needs to drop 10 or 20% fairly soon, and that's one of the things we're doing. So it does show that there are some pathways for natural gas, potentially from Norway, where you can get under there. And there are other countries with very, very low, purportedly very, very low methane leakage rates that can also do it. But one of the biggest challenges we have at the moment is actually verifying the upstream methane leakage rates. Not in terms of the science of whether you can measure it, but what values are used to calculate those emissions. So the EU has actually done a fairly good job, I think, in this. As you can see from the graph here, from the first three countries over there, and that includes the US, blue hydrogen production from US LNG is dead in the water. You can't do it in the EU according to the rules that have been, or actually they're not quite adopted, but they'll hopefully be in force in about a month, in about a month's time. And that is with a so-called default value for upstream methane of 1.2% leakage. So they're saying you only lose 1.2% of the methane upstream. And actually, we think that is underplaying what leakage rates really are. I think we've seen sort of, I think Beth, you alluded to, anything between 1% and 8%. If we had to put a sort of a number on the global upstream methane sort of leakage rate, we think it would be around 3.2%. So, 3 times what the European Union has done there. So blue hydrogen has a really sort of tall order to get under the bar there. This is another graph. I'll just speak to it very shortly, but essentially there are lots of other steps in the process that need to be taken on board. So you can see from Australia, that's not going to work in Japan's context necessarily either. In terms of the capture rate of carbon, so you limit the upstream methane, you want to capture the carbon sort of upstream, you have 2 options. You have an SMR production facility, steam methane reforming, or you have newer facilities which are called ATR, autothermal reforming. And we think those ATR facilities, a lot has been said about them. The challenge is there is not one ATR facility operating in the world anywhere which has captured the amount of carbon that you need to be seen as a truly low carbon alternative. So, we at GH2, and I think a lot of our partners, we're saying, listen, we will sort of tip our hats if blue hydrogen does manage, one, to be as low carbon as it can be, but we'll also tip our hats if they can get the cost down to a level which is investable. And at the moment, we really don't see that. And that was confirmed by the International Energy Agency, I think just 10 days ago, who confirmed that I think since 2024, no new final investment decision has been made on any blue hydrogen project any in the world. So if people come up to you to say blue hydrogen is cheaper than green, I think you need to interrogate them a little bit more on that statement.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Morgan, is there anything you wanted to jump in on there?
Yeah, Okay, perfect. I will just add in the U.S. context, this has been particularly tricky and challenging because, as Beth noted in the beginning, there's a huge range of methane leakage rate from different basins. And we know this from empirical measurements of satellite data. And yet, despite this range, the model that determines your eligibility for the tax credit in the US assumes one number, which is 0.9%. So that's maybe around the Appalachia bar down at the bottom. And it allows now companies to submit their own values, which are not based on sufficiently verified data. So you can essentially cherry pick whatever number you want. So people are able to claim the tax credit and claim an emissions intensity that's much lower than the actual number. So that's really worrisome and something that we would like to see companies hold themselves to a higher standard and use real measured data. The other thing I just wanted to note is that this is, we're talking about hydrogen here, but this is really relevant for a lot of other products that depend on hydrogen, like ammonia, methanol, and several other e-fuels. So the end products that get used in shipping and aviation and fertilizer and all of these sectors, this is exactly what affects that carbon intensity, what we've been talking about.
Okay, thank you. Morgan, I'd love for you to hang on to the mic and now talk a little bit about hydrogen emissions. I sort of teed that up, but it warrants more explanation.
Sure. So the last factor that we wanted to raise affecting the climate intensity of hydrogen is that the hydrogen molecule itself has a global warming potential. It is a very leaky molecule. It's the smallest in the universe, and it leaks easier than methane, and it actually increases climate warming because it increases the concentration of other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There's been a lot of research into that. What is that warming potential number? And there's been a lot of, consensus building in the scientific community that the number is substantial. Even over a 100-year period, which is sort of the end of that x-axis, it is 12 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide. And then in the near term, if you look at like 20 years, for example, it's extremely steep. It's around 37. That has a really similar effect to what we know about methane, that it is a short-lived climate pollutant, sort of a super polluter, and we need to pay attention to it in a slightly different way than we do carbon dioxide. So we need to be thinking about decision-making on both a near-term and long-term time horizon. The other thing about hydrogen emissions is that we don't yet know how much is leaking. Beth mentioned the range of like less than 1% leakage all the way up to 20% in certain supply chains. EDF is doing a lot of work to quantify those emissions. We have a measurement campaign with several researchers from Cornell, West Virginia, and Utrecht University, and we're going out into the field and using a new commercial device to measure hydrogen emissions at the facility level. And so there's several other organizations doing similar quantification methods. We're hoping to get some more certainty around that leakage rate, so that you can plug and play into the LCA equation, here's the global warming potential and here's the leakage rate, and incorporate that really into decision making. And so I think this is where sort of I'd expect to see some really exciting progress over the next couple years. The UK and the EU have both acknowledged this in their guidance documents around hydrogen and have required operators to put in practice leakage prevention measures, and they've acknowledged that that global warming potential number will be incorporated in future life cycle assessments.
Yeah, just maybe to add really shortly on that, I think there's also an economic rationale as well for limiting hydrogen emissions. I mean, you might have seen in the news that, low carbon hydrogen production is not quite as cheap as we all thought it was going to be 2 or 3 years ago. And so, truly low carbon hydrogen is actually a valuable commodity. And so if you're a business producing this stuff, you don't want it sort of being evacuated to the atmosphere. You want to hold on to it so you can sell all of it. So I think there's the global warming sort of potential, which is really important. The UK and the EU have put in place provisions to look at this, and thanks to EDF and others, this is improving. But simply the economic rationale for a company, they don't want to be losing their valuable hydrogen. They want to be selling it into an end use. So there's lots of sort of reasons that coalesce to look at this issue.
Great, thank you. So before we open this up to hear from all of you, I want to make sure we sort of close the loop here. We've talked about some of the elements that really determine hydrogen's climate benefits. How does this play out in the standard setting process? Maybe, Morgan, you could kick us off there.
Sure. Well, I have a slide with a lot of information. This is a summary of how different standards across the world are handling some of these elements that we just talked about. You'll see, a lot of different jurisdictions have set their own thresholds. That's okay as long as the standards are able to sort of talk to one another. Some jurisdictions are making some great progress in some of these metrics, like South Korea has required a 90% or above capture rate in order for any of their imported product to be, eligible for their market. China has actually made some really interesting recent progress in setting some pretty ambitious thresholds for renewable-based hydrogen or electrolytic hydrogen. 2.0 is sort of the lowest number we're seeing amongst jurisdictions. And last thing I'll say is we need more harmonization across these. They can't each treat everything differently, because then people don't know what product they're importing or purchasing and whether it meets different regulations. So the ISO process is sort of that top line. It is an attempt to create a more harmonized methodology. There's still some progress to be made there.
Yeah, and just to add, not on here is India also at 2.0 for green hydrogen. That's another good one. But just to double click on the ISO process, as Morgan said, that is a really critical tool that will be very helpful to have these different standards be able to talk to each other. So my 4 is double your 2, but are we talking about the same ruler? Like, is the measuring stick that we're all using the same? And that's a really important thing to get right. So as a member of the working group developing that standard, I think it's a really valuable tool that we're developing. But currently, as Morgan said, it really does fall short on many of these metrics. So yeah, that's one area where there does need to be some progress for the benefits of that comparability to come to fruition.
Yeah, thanks. Well, and I'll just add that, Pete, both you and Joe are active in the ISO working group and sort of have a insider view on how that's playing out and really why it's significant. So yeah, I'd just love to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if any of you have had the pleasure of sitting on an ISO working group for sort of emissions calculation, but it's an interesting experience, and it's been quite a learning curve sort of for me, and I think for Pete as well, going through lots and lots of sort of formulas and spreadsheets. But there is a serious point here, and a number of governments around the world will be relying on the methodology that the ISO is currently putting together. And so by the end of this year, probably at COP30, the idea is to sort of launch a vote on this international standard. And one thing is important to remember, this international standard will not set an emissions threshold. So if you're into defining zero emission fuels, global fuel intensity limits, the ISO standard is not going to help you at all. It's not going to tell you, a truly clean hydrogen is 1 kilogram of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen, or lower. But what it will do, if it can be enhanced and improved upon, is it will help everyone, as Pete and Morgan said, to measure those emissions and have a mutually agreed way of measuring. And we engage with governments all around the world. Japan and Korea, key import markets for hydrogen. These countries talk about being hydrogen economies. They want to use it everywhere. They will be using this ISO standard to measure the emissions for their own standards. We know countries like Aruba, indeed are putting together their own standards in this space for the sector to take off. This ISO standard could be a guide, but what we would say is you should sort of use it with a pinch of salt. Have it as a guide, but also try to get some advice from people like us to sort of help you understand how it could be enhanced and improved upon. We're working very actively with the Indonesian government at the moment. It will ultimately become a huge hydrogen user. We're talking sort of a couple of decades down the line, but it will become, and they're looking very closely at this ISO standard. So it might sound esoteric, it might sound like why are these guys talking about methodologies, but this is the calculator that governments around the world are going to end up coalescing around, and it's really important.
Yeah, well said, thank you. So any other final comments from any of you before we sort of shift gears here? Any other policy frameworks, CBAM, or other things you want to talk about?
I just think on that topic of why having a harmonization of methodologies matters, when we look at the global landscape of hydrogen development, there's clearly import markets and export markets emerging. I heard Joe talk about Japan and Korea, also the European Union, all gearing up to import, if not hydrogen, because it's very hard to transport, then hydrogen commodities like ammonia or green iron. And then there's places like India, where there is amazing progress happening on bringing down the costs of green hydrogen because renewables there are just so cheap. So we're seeing, areas of the world where there's likely to be exporters, areas of the world where there's going to be importers, and that's why it's so important that we have a harmonized framework so we're all speaking the same language to enable the trade of truly credibly green commodities between those countries.
Wonderful, thank you.
I would just say the market looks different than it did 2 years ago, and we're seeing sort of a recalibration of demand, supply, and now is not the time for us to be watering down the projects that move forward. We need to be making sure that the fewer number of projects we're likely to see are the best ones, and that they're really setting a strong precedent for future work here. I think there's still a lot of hope. Bloomberg, BNEF, what is this, New Energy Finance, just came out with a report last week about how there is a very steep green premium for hydrogen derivatives in the fertilizer space, in shipping, in aviation, and that's driven by EU regulation. It's driven by the carbon border adjustment mechanism that will come into effect in the EU, and it's driven also by corporate commitments. So I think, you know, there's a lot to be excited about in this sector, but only if we actually keep it as a climate solution.
And also, I'll add to that, you know, what's happening at the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is really going to be driving, you know, if done well, demand for clean and green hydrogen. So something else to keep on our radar. We might want to bring that up in the discussion. So I'd like to start bringing more of you into this conversation. Thank you for listening. I wanted to start, if you're game, Simon, we have Simon Ben-Maraz from IRENA. He heads up IRENA's Information and Technology Center, and we put him on the spot and asked him if he could make a few comments and reactions to what we've discussed so far today. Is that okay? And
thank you, Beth. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Simon Ben-Maraz from IRENA. I lead the work on energy planning. And in that regard, we are engaging with a number of countries in discussing harmonization of standards for green hydrogen. IRENA is a member-led organization. We have 173 countries part of IRENA. We also created a few years ago the collaborative framework on green hydrogen. So this is a space, essentially a peer-to-peer space for countries to discuss on the evolution of policies, frameworks, financing conditions for specific aspects. We have 8 frameworks, and one of them is on green hydrogen. This one is actually very vibrant. It's collated by Germany and the UAE. We have a mix of importer and exporter countries that are really have had a keen look at actually a similar table about what does it mean to produce green hydrogen, what are the harmonizing standards, and how, for example, for the local specific use, how this will apply. So, for example, in the last framework meeting, we had the managing director of Sowitech in Kenya, who explained that, for example, for them, they will like, because of the Kenyan energy system, they will like to use geothermal flue gas to actually use CO2. But they were not really sure about the sustainability of those CO2 sources for their solution. So all those actually for them is kind of a risk they would like to reduce, but also require that especially for the domestic use, there is a pragmatic approach because obviously they're signing a lot of MOUs. We also had Egypt there. They launched in 2024 their low carbon hydrogen strategy, and they are looking at organizing it both for the meeting their own end-use demands, but also to look at exporting in Africa in collaboration with the African Union, for example. So all of that create a lot of unclarity about, for example, hourly production, geographical production, how to calculate. You mentioned, Joe, about the calculation tables. There is many that they are using, and the message was really a call for harmonizing that, for them to accelerate actually that, because as you know, a lot of countries are hopefully submitting the NDCs by COP30. IRENA supports countries in developing the NDC, both on the power and end-use sectors, and those questions arise especially because when they're developing the strategy, they're looking already at the condition to enable more bankable projects, so really offtake credibility and so on. And those aspects actually are discussed with the financial institutions. And many developing countries will be looking at conditional financing for the NDC. And those questions are actually at the center of how to bridge the access to capital for the project there. So a diversity of countries, obviously not only on the global south, we're discussing with the European Union, country like Finland also mentioned the work on carbon capture and storage and so on. So we have a vibrant community that actually today not will love to join the ISO meeting, but are looking for a quick way to accelerate basically the 2030 targets there, and also find way to resolve the issue, for example, of how to use excess renewable energy now to enter the market and with the viable commodities. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonas Möber, a colleague of Joe's from the Green Hydrogen Organization. It's great to hear this. Could I just follow up on this? It's so excellent to hear about this working group. We here have an ISO standard that is both, from what the panel is saying, a real enabler, the harmonizing, but it's also the major threat to undermining genuine low-carbon hydrogen. How is IRENA marshalling renewable hydrogen, not fossil fuel-based hydrogen, informing those countries that this ISO process, unless we get it right, may actually undermine all we're standing for?
Thank you, Jonas. I think that's at the center of the pragmatism we advocate at IRENA there, because obviously a lot of the credibility of countries when they introduce energy and climate plans there rely on a substantial amount of green hydrogen there. And today, there has been question, for example, of a country who would like to produce, but today the underlying, I would say, approach is perceived as not meeting those. And obviously here, the ISO or the normalization work there, because it's ISO is a specific one, you have other communities that are working there, should basically not reduce the potential of developing those communities in the future there. So if we basically have too much academic discussion on this, it will slow down the rollout of pilot phase for countries to develop their basically infrastructure to even more scale up the production there. So it's a gray area where we need normalization. This is important. In any fields, that's part of the work that country would like to push. Germany has done a lot of work on normalization, but also we need to accelerate the pragmatism of we need form of green hydrogen in any roadmaps we have to decarbonize economies, to deliver a net zero future by a specific date now, maybe not 2050, but at some point. So this needs to be pragmatically discussed with country in a way that also enable the policymakers to enact new laws that are comply with the global, I would say, mechanism in place there.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Jonas. I mean, I think you've highlighted what a critical moment we are at to get alignment across these standards. These are difficult conversations. We have to get it right, and we really need, the engagement of many of the folks in this room. So I'm wondering if other people want to jump into the conversation. Either it could be a question for our panel, it could be a comment on what you've heard, it could be an intervention on what we really should be talking about. I'd love to hear reactions in the room. So anyone who would like to join. Jean? Yeah.
Well, thanks for all of this. It's very interesting. I was struck by the very first slide, the COP30 action plan, and I hadn't seen that before, and I scanned down to number 27, which was digital infrastructure and AI and all that's going on there. I think it's just important to introduce into the discussion that there's a massive new competitor for these electrons, and that competitor is very deep-pocketed, very low risk to service, and without a doubt, the rise of AI and data centers are going to impact the growth of green hydrogen in ways that we probably didn't fully see 18 months ago. Kind of got it a year ago. Definitely get it now. So it's just got to be part of the discussion. My company, World Energy, is a large project on the west coast of Newfoundland. We've been developing it for quite a few years now, and we've learned a lot about what isn't going to work. And I think the big takeaway for us was we were a project that was designed to create ammonia and take it to Europe and offload it where it would be cracked back to hydrogen and then go on to users there. That's not going to work. It's just you step on the hydrogen too many times, you lose all of its value. And once you kind of arrive at that conclusion, it's so obvious we can't figure out why it took us so long. Hydrogen's original appeal, as you said, Beth, was that we could move clean energy around in a different form. And that's really attractive at a high level. But then when you work down into the weeds of that, you lose so much of the energy at each step along the way. It's really hard to do that in a meaningful way. So the big takeaway, at least for us, and I think this applies broadly, is you've got to bring the use to the hydrogen. You can't bring the hydrogen to the use. You can do things like, the green iron as a carrier is a much better carrier than ammonia. I know that we were just talking about ammonia for shipping, but you still got to get the stuff around. And the emissions associated with distribution often get discounted. And so if we're going to be intellectually honest about this, it's not about where it's produced, it's where it's used. And so I think all of these things will point us to the same conclusions that we paid tens of millions of dollars learning, which is you got to bring the use to the hydrogen. And you're going to be in a battle with data centers for those electrons.
That's a great point about the data centers, and something that I think we can all learn from, looking at, especially in the US right now, but globally this is definitely true, how grid operators and utilities are reacting to that sudden growth in load without, I would say without adequate guardrails in place. And what we're seeing is a big build out of new fossil generation, or at least expanded build out of new fossil generation that's going to be locked in for decades. And I think that's a real warning for the green hydrogen industry. If this industry is going to be adding load in any way comparable to data centers, we need to be getting that much better than the data center industry is doing right now. And I think that comes down to standards, accounting frameworks, and hopefully with updates to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, amongst other frameworks, tech companies will also be held to account for their emissions and not be able to make claims to be using renewables that aren't credible. But that's also a work in progress. And then on the trade, I totally take that point. I think the green iron trade is a particularly exciting option. And yet co-location wherever it's possible is definitely the superior solution for efficiency, for avoiding leakage, and saving costs.
Yeah, definitely. If you're into to shipping and you can make ammonia where you're bunkering, ships, then that's the place to do it, and you don't worry about the transport side. Your point around AI is really important. And 3 years ago, as part of the Global Renewables Alliance, we were part of this push for a sort of a tripling of renewable energy capacity by 2030. And now I think I wish we'd sort of pushed for even more than that, because that was sort of just before the AI sort of wave really got going. But of course the answer is just deploy, and costs are going down. We know that solar is now the cheapest form of energy, and some countries are doing better than others there. One thing I would say on sort of the competition with green hydrogen is data centers need electricity to operate, but they're also being built all over the world, and those data centers use steel. And if you're a big tech company like Microsoft or Google, and you have net zero sort of commitments, you've got to look at your embedded emissions related to all of that steel. And do you know what happened earlier this week? Microsoft signed a deal with Stegra, a green steel company, using green hydrogen. So it's going to be in the mix, but that's not to take away the fact that AI is definitely a big one on the load.
Oh, great. Hi, Beth.
Hi, I'm Beth Dean from Electric Hydrogen, and I just wanted to kind of build on this AI and also the kind of changes. We don't know how they're going to evolve, because I think fuel cells are having this incredible boom, and you have to put something in the fuel cell. Obviously, it would be great to put hydrogen in, but we don't have the infrastructure. So I know we've been working on thinking about how do you book and claim solve this, which gets down to an accounting issue ultimately. But at the same time, we don't know how costs are going to go. Everybody thinks, hydrogen costs are just going to keep going up. But in fact, the IEA report just noted that there is a possibility of bringing them down, which then goes to the kind of how projects can get built. So I guess I just want to encourage us all to be aware that we don't really know how things unfold and things change so quickly. And how can we sort of, thinking about all these emissions across all the methane and the, H2 and everything, how do we sort of future-proof our aspirations so that we don't get left behind, particularly with respect to data centers and the demands there?
Thanks for mentioning that piece, Beth. And to sort of explain what Beth's referring to on the book and claim piece, EDF and Electric Hydrogen have been working with ERM to start digging into the question of how you might set up a certificate program for hydrogen. Oftentimes what you see is a hydrogen facility is right next to a fertilizer facility, but that fertilizer facility does not have the marginal willingness to pay for that cleaner product. So could you have someone further down the supply chain, like Pepsi, pay for that green premium, and then Pepsi gets to claim the credit of the emissions reduction when the clean hydrogen or clean ammonia is actually being used in the fertilizer facility, where it's an easy swap for the dirty to clean. So that's all, I think we have a lot more thinking to be done along those lines, but that would be one way to start to build a market for hydrogen, in the short term.
We had a comment from the corner, a question from the corner. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. So thank you everyone for the panel. I have learned a lot. My name is Ravena. I'm a social environmental lawyer from Brazil. And I would like to add my perspective from a place in which it's actually being installed, the biggest green hydrogen plant in the world. And I actually came here, we have come here to try to see and understand from your organizations how you're cooperating with local communities. Because actually in our region, the installation of green hydrogen, it's getting very controversial right now. So I think I'm going to bring a bit of a new perspective. This is a region in which we don't have access to drinking water. And the communities are extremely concerned with the water consumption of the plant, especially due to the fact that the entire process of the licensing for the green hydrogen plant in question has been speeded up to the point that it dismantled federal environmental regulations. And this is something that is happening in states across the Brazilian Northeast. The Brazilian Northeast is now a global hub for green hydrogen installation of plants. And it's also associated to serious concerns of also biodiversity loss and deforestation. Because basically what is happening is that some local policies are increasing, for example, the generalized generation of solar panels in cases in our region that are displacing communities, rural low-income communities, to install these panels so that it can feed the green hydrogen plants. And the communities in our region have not been consulted about this plant. It is located in an environmental conservation unit in Brazil. As you know, Brazil has a very strong environmental legislation, and we live in the environmental protected unit of the Delta region. It's the largest open sea delta, one of the largest in the world. And there is a very fine balance between the salinization of the water, because it's an encounter of fresh water and salt water, right? So this plant that is being installed inside the Delta region may alter the patterns of salinization of the water and affect our ecosystems, which are incredibly important for the climate. And I don't know right now, in Brazil, there's actually a growing concern for how renewables projects and green hydrogen are being installed without a consideration for human rights, for traditional communities' rights, and biodiversity protection. In fact, 1 in every 3 renewables projects are now inside a social environmental protected area. So I wanted to hear your perspectives about this, what I see from, I live 70 kilometers away from this green hydrogen plant, and now the case has been filed in court. So I would like to know, how do you see a potential, for example, in a country like Brazil, who is so important for the climate, what I think now it might be a very dangerous gambling between biodiversity protection and this massive, fast expansion of renewables, because I've heard here a lot about pragmatism and how things need to move as fast as possible. But there are people and regions and nature in the places where these projects are being installed that unfortunately are not being heard enough. So
Thank you so much. First, let me just say, I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so glad you put those issues on this table that we've set here. We have focused on the climate aspects of hydrogen and how to maximize climate benefits. There's so many more issues that we need to be engaging on, and you've beautifully laid out many of them, the community, the biodiversity, water. There's so many issues here. So, I'm afraid we haven't really prepared to go into all of those issues, and we need to. This would take a whole nother session that we really should organize soon. But I wonder does the panel want to comment on any of these things, just to kind of scratch the surface?
I mean, I definitely echo Beth's sentiments there. Thank you so much for bringing these topics up. I think the energy access and water access for local communities where these projects are being built has to be prioritized, for one thing, as well as, of course, the considerations for nature and the ecosystems. But it is obviously going to be very galling to see huge build-outs of energy generation in places where people may not even have currently access to energy that they can afford and use themselves. So I think making sure that that is done with sensitivity is going to be a crucial aspect of this, alongside all the great other issues that you brought up there.
Yeah, and maybe just to add very, very briefly, first of all, thank you for raising it. The truth is also that producing green hydrogen at a cost low enough to actually be deployed around the world is a real challenge at the moment. So we have that on one extreme, and on the other we have the valid environmental and social impact of renewable energy and green hydrogen projects, and we mustn't necessarily see them in opposition. Like a good green hydrogen project generally won't go forward unless there's community buy-in, or it shouldn't. I'm sure about that. So we shouldn't see those two things in opposition. But very practically, as the Green Hydrogen Organization, and call out to Claire here, who's been a big supporter of us, and the Green Hydrogen Standard that we put together a couple of years ago. That has a section on emissions measurement and all these 3-pillar issues, but a lot of the standard is exactly about those issues you mentioned there: water scarcity, community consultation. So I'm afraid we haven't translated it into Brazilian, Portuguese yet, but happy to talk to you about it as well. There was also a great initiative at COP28. It was a joint agreement on the responsible deployment of renewables-based hydrogen, which has a lot of guidance and principles that should be put in place for these projects. So very happy to share both of those with you to disseminate back home, etc.
Thank you. And I'll just add that, this new clean, decarbonized economy we're building out here, we have to make sure that it is equitable, that it respects biodiversity, it respects communities. It's like an awesome responsibility that we have all taken on here. And none of this is easy, and we just have to keep grappling with these issues. I think we had a question down here, a comment or intervention.
Hi, thanks so much for all of this. I'm Emily from David Gardner and Associates. I have a question going back to the comments about the distribution and end use side of things, particularly about the boundaries of the standards that we're looking at. I think an early slide from Beth had shown that most of these standards are well to gate for the hydrogen emissions. the EU is the only one that includes distribution and end use. So maybe first, Joe, I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about how that works. And then for others, I'd be curious if you have thoughts on whether that is like the end goal for the other standards or if that is feasible or not.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The majority are sort of, well to production gate, as we say. But the EU, in both its renewable green hydrogen standard as well as its low carbon standard, is well to consumption gate, essentially. And this is really important, not just in the context of the EU, and something we've engaged the Japanese and Korean government on a lot. Because as you know, Japan and Korea, they're going to need to import green hydrogen, potentially blue hydrogen if they can meet the environmental credentials too. And so one thing we've constantly questioned them on is, if you're an importer, why does your standard not include transportation? I mean, it just like, and you sort of literally look them in the eye and you say, why doesn't it include transportation? And they don't give you an answer, and it stays the same, and yet you have to include transportation, otherwise you're not including the full value there. So, I mean, yeah, just echoing what you said, really, but that needs to change. The boundary needs to get wider.
And on like the ISO front, there is a separate part of the standard for, so there's like the -1 standard is the production, but then there's distribution and storage. There's like a separate, I think, liquefaction section as well, and these are all being developed. They're a bit behind the production one in terms of the stage they're at. So the thing that's going to be launched for a vote at COP is just the production part, but there is intention to harmonize around methodology to account for all the stages of the ecosystem. So hopefully, I mean, again, it has to have the caveat that it needs to be done rigorously, but there is at least intention to account for those other aspects.
Thank you. Tristan Smith, University College London. My focus is on the shipping industry, which I hope will be a significant off-taker of green hydrogen, likely in the form of ammonia. But my question and comment is really to do with the accountancy standards that you're describing. Is it fair to say they're only as good as the certification associated with their execution? So we can have a really perfect accountancy standard, but if the certification is weak, the process for applying this in practice is weak, then we could have a risk. And I bring this up in the context of the IMO because one problem is within countries that have hydrogen policies that might have producers and off-takers, or regions like the EU. And I feel there that there's some logic that their certification should be held to a high standard. But in the IMO, in the shipping use, we have a bit of a moral hazard because the IMO's jurisdiction is only on the off-taker. It's not on the producer. So they almost are incentivized. I'm not saying I'm not trying to accuse them of fraud. I'm trying to say that there is this risk that their incentive is to get very high quality accountancy standards that keep everyone happy in the way that your effort is going towards. But then the problem of certification is something that isn't something they control. They have no just jurisdiction over the countries. And we have a risk that that is then not completed. And I wonder if the panel sees a way in which we can use some of the other hydrogen national level plans to mitigate any of that risk. And my second part of the question is related to the subject of mass balance, which was brought up on the panel. This is something of a rallying call to the LNG community and the biogas community, which are basically the competitive risk for hydrogen in the shipping industry. The European regulation allows someone who is producing and consuming biogas anywhere in the grid to claim when they bunker a ship with methane that is biogas, even if it's bunkering fossil methane. And the LNG lobby has made a very strong call now for the IMO to adopt something similar, even though, again, it has no jurisdiction over the land side. It only has jurisdiction over the ship. And so their argument is we need this because that'll enable us to take advantage of biogas in shipping. If that happens, then we will have no business case for hydrogen because the low-cost biogas will destroy investment case in hydrogen. So I think we need to be very careful in how we say something which might be useful for getting hydrogen moving could be used by the other side to undermine the investment cases that we also need. And I wondered if the panel could comment on whether they can see how we can manage that.
Wow, so a couple of really tough questions.
I was going to take the second one as well.
All right, just quickly on the first, I'm very happy to be punting on the second, but we can talk about it. But on certification, yeah, I mean, ISO has nothing to say about credible certification. It's just a calculator. But the jurisdictions that put in place their own standards, they have certification schemes of various degrees of robustness. So, we know all the problems around certification for biofuels in the EU. We hope they've learned some lessons there. There are now, I think, 3 or 4 agencies which have been recognized by the European Commission to certify product under the EU rules. And so we can share contacts with you on them. The UK produced its own low carbon hydrogen standard, back actually in 2021, so it's the first one out there. I don't think they're even there with their own certification scheme under the UK standard, so there is a lot of work to do there. Over to mass balance.
I was just going to offer a generic comment that I think you're totally right that these kind of book and claim systems do have opportunities for abuse, and they need to have rigorous guardrails on them. I think in particular, some kind of deliverability requirement is absolutely necessary. I don't think that it's justifiable to say if you plug anywhere into a continent-wide pipeline network, you can claim that that's been used by someone on the other side of the continent. I think, we need to be strict about where and when we deploy book and claim systems to make sure that they're effective and they're not undermining progress. But there is probably some role for such systems with the appropriate guardrails in place.
Yeah, the project that we were working on was specifically to explore what environmental integrity, whether you could do this in an environmentally integral, high integrity way. And so thank you for flagging another risk, I guess, which is the precedent that it sets in other markets. So even if we were to set deliverability bounds, which we've discussed, we also discussed what bounds do you have around, like, is this just in setting? Like, it has to be the same supply chain? Does it have to be, would it have to be a mass balance, sort of, you have physical, you physically know, physical connection to the molecule. So there's all kinds of, like, boundaries that you could put on this. And I think we need to have we need to continue that conversation on whether it's possible to do. And also, what does that mean for other markets that are trying to, set up similar but, looser systems?
Yeah, and I guess that the whole principle behind these sort of book and claim or mass balance systems at the beginning is to handle a nascent sector that doesn't have the infrastructure in place yet to get going. So, I mean, I've no idea if this works in the IMO sort of context, but is there any way that you could sort of differentiate between technologies that are already out there and have infrastructure, LNG and bio, and then say, but for new technologies, you can do it? I don't know, but it's just trying to sort of square the circle, but just an idea.
The parallels to electricity are great there. I mean, 15, 20 years ago when we first started buying and selling RECs, they were a great kind of helpful revenue stream to get early projects online. Today, an annual REC from anywhere in the United States is a completely inadequate certificate to claim that you've actually used renewable electricity. And this is exactly what the Greenhouse Gas Protocol update is trying to correct. As that technology has matured and has greater market penetration, you really need to tighten those rules around environmental attribute certificates. And I think that's going to apply in all of these different sectors and commodities.
Well, thank you. Great questions. We probably have time for 1 or 2 more interventions. If anyone else would like to get in on the conversation, we have someone over here.
Yep, I'm Alex from Energy Tag, and I heard Greenhouse Gas Protocol, so I'd love to talk more about that. We focus on electricity emissions accounting and really pushing for more granularity in that space, so towards this hourly locational matching side of things. So you talked about sort of the green hydrogen standards sort of across the world, and definitely in the US and EU, as requiring these 3 pillars, and there hasn't been as much pushback in the US more recently, which is good. There certainly is very hot debate on the greenhouse gas protocol update process right now. And that's kind of carrying over into the Science-Based Targets Initiative update process. And I'm curious how you see all of this interacting, how you see maybe the hydrogen standards influencing things like the GHGP process or vice versa. Kind of just riff on kind of those processes and how that's going to play out.
Yeah, absolutely. As you flagged, there's many parallel forums where this is being considered currently. And what's really interesting is that hydrogen has kind of paved the way for a lot of these other bodies to consider moving towards hourly matching and geographical matching and incrementality. Whenever this comes up, 45V and the EU RFMBO rules are always like the prime example of where this has been implemented today already, and to show that it is feasible to do and to put into regulations. So I think that's one way hydrogen is definitely influencing these conversations. And then if you look to like the ISO standard for hydrogen that we've been discussing, which currently doesn't address these problems, I think we're going to see that as the electricity accounting world more widely hopefully moves towards these solutions, that then ISO will be forced to follow. Because there has actually recently been an announcement between ISO and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to cooperate and harmonize on these topics. And although that's not directly the hydrogen working group who's committed to cooperate, the hydrogen standard references other ISO standards, which are kind of going to be moving forward in alignment with GHGP. So I don't know, I can't say for sure if GHGP will lead ISO or ISO will lead GHGP or exactly where that will land, but I do think the direction of travel across the board is hopefully in the direction of more accurate, more granular accounting.
Yes, we can hope for that. All right, one last comment, question, intervention from the room. Oh, I think I have a hand over here. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Karen Quackenbush with the Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Energy Association. I know there's a lot of emphasis on the current standards at ISO TC 197 SC1. I'm just familiar enough with the process to understand, the scope limitations they will have and the ability they have to do other standards that address these other areas that you're focusing on. I'm just wondering if there have been any attempts, rather than to force fit, something into a scope where it doesn't fit, to actually develop new documents that link to the existing standards, so that in the end, when there's international consensus, they might be pulled together and end up with a product that's meeting what I'm hearing your need is.
Thanks for the question. I think that this process needs to be flexible because everybody's moving at a different pace, and each thing needs to be able to be updated and referencing sort of like best practice. And that's part of the reason I think that ISO has split up the different working groups, so that first we try to tackle the production side where countries have already started establishing their standards. Then we'll start talking about the transport and, liquefaction and all processing, all of those phases. Then we'll talk about ammonia and other derivatives. I think, ISO says that they are not a policy making. It's not a policy document. It is a methodology document, and that is totally fair. I think it's important that it is at least referencing the latest science on all fronts, even if it's not yet ready to make a recommendation, because certain countries have more capacity than others to be able to do their own. Like the UK has done so much research into some of these topics themselves, but some other countries don't have that capacity. And so they need to be able to see ISO as a useful reference document and have everything sort of mentioned there that they should have on their radar. So that's what we're hoping to see. Even footnotes are helpful, and then the next revision process can make progress in the future.
Okay, great, thank you. Great question. Okay, so we're kind of winding down here. Thank you so much for all the comments and questions and your attention throughout this session. I just want to remind everyone before we break that we do have a buffet lunch right outside. this room. You're all welcome to spend some time hanging out here and continuing these informal conversations over lunch. To wrap up, I just want to thank our panelists and also just ask you one last rapid fire question, if you're willing to take it, which is, we've talked about a lot of complexity here, a lot of difficult issues. This is not easy. What are you most optimistic about?
I think the news about the tenders for green ammonia in India under $600 a ton is incredibly encouraging news. So, and that's all kind of dedicated renewables, big off-grid projects, so meeting the guardrails, at least on the climate front, that we've laid out, although, of course, there's other things to consider, but that's a cause for optimism, I would say.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, similar one. I'm excited about the world's largest green hydrogen plant, which is making green ammonia in Inner Mongolia at the moment. A company called Envision is producing and beginning to export, so it's starting.
And I mentioned already the green premium that BNEF is citing. I think the number I remember for the shipping space is like 75 to 260% of a premium that they expect companies to be willing to pay for cleaner ammonia. So that's a really exciting market opportunity.
Very wonderful. So thank you all so much for being here. And, I hope we've left you with a sense of urgency, an understanding of all these complexities that we can work on together, and also some optimism. This is very important. We need hydrogen if we're going to decarbonize our global economy by mid-century. So let's continue to work together to make that happen. So thank you all.